The spotless marble floors of Pinnacle Insurance's office shimmered under the stark fluorescent lights, creating an unwelcoming clinical atmosphere. Ayanna Brooks stepped cautiously inside, her grip firm on a meticulously arranged folder. Her palms were clammy, and she inhaled deeply, steadying the rapid rhythm of her heartbeat. Approaching the receptionist's desk, she spoke with measured confidence. "I have an appointment with Mr. Whitmore." The receptionist, a stern woman with a precise bun and an indifferent demeanor, didn't look up immediately. "Name?" she asked, her tone mechanical. "Ayanna Brooks." The receptionist tapped quickly on her keyboard, then gave a curt nod, gesturing toward a line of cold, black leather chairs lining the wall. "Take a seat. He'll call you shortly." Ayanna offered a polite "thank you" and moved to the waiting area. The room exuded the sterility of a space designed to instill unease. She adjusted her posture, smoothing her skirt, and replayed the checklist in her mind. Her application had been double-checked, triple-checked. She met every requirement. Yet, a gnawing sense of dread crept in, fed by countless tales of unspoken bias within institutions like this. "Miss Brooks?" Ayanna's head snapped up. A man in the doorway stood with a practiced smile. His tailored suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable. "I'm Thomas Whitmore. Follow me." She rose, clutching her folder tightly, and walked into his office. The space mirrored the impersonal coldness of the reception area. Abstract corporate art lined the walls, offering little comfort. Whitmore motioned for her to sit, as he eased into his leather chair behind a massive desk that seemed designed to intimidate. He flipped open her file, his practiced smile never faltering. "You're applying for individual health coverage, correct? Tell me a little about why you're here today." Ayanna straightened her back, her voice even. "I was recently diagnosed with a chronic illness. I need reliable coverage to manage my treatment and maintain my health. I've reviewed your policy's requirements thoroughly, and I'm confident I meet all of them." Whitmore's lips stretched slightly, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Let's see about that." His casual dismissal sent a jolt of unease through Ayanna, but she steeled herself, refusing to let her discomfort show. The next moments dragged as Whitmore leafed through her documents, his deliberate pace suggesting he was searching for a flaw. When he finally looked up, his expression was a disarming mixture of detachment and condescension. "Well, Ms. Brooks," he began, his tone overly smooth, "you certainly seem organized. Proof of income, diagnosis confirmation, proof of residency, all very thorough." "Thank you," Ayanna replied carefully, sensing something amiss. Whitmore placed the papers down and interlocked his fingers. "But there are concerns." "Concerns?" Ayanna echoed, her brows knitting. "I've ensured everything aligns with your requirements. Freelance graphic designer, correct?" Whitmore's voice carried a hint of skepticism. "That sort of income can be inconsistent." Ayanna's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "I've been in business for 5 years with a stable clientele. My income consistently meets the thresholds set by your policies. It's all documented in the tax records I provided." Whitmore tilted his head, feigning mild amusement. "On paper, sure, but freelance work is unpredictable. One dry month, and suddenly you're behind on premiums." Ayanna forced a composed tone. "That's why I've planned carefully. My financial records show consistency, even during challenging times." Whitmore leaned back, chuckling softly as though humoring a naive child. "Plans can only account for so much, Ms. Brooks. Chronic illnesses can be quite costly. We have to consider the long-term viability of our coverage options." "What does that mean?" Ayanna asked, her frustration seeping through. "Are you suggesting I'm not viable for reasons unrelated to the criteria?" Whitmore's smile tightened, his gaze sharpening. "We evaluate applicants holistically. It's not just about meeting the minimum requirements. We assess sustainability." "Sustainability?" Ayanna pressed, her voice firm. "Your vague terminology doesn't explain why my application is being scrutinized. If I meet the qualifications, what's the issue?" Whitmore hesitated, his facade cracking momentarily before he masked it with feigned professionalism. "There are patterns, Ms. Brooks. Applicants in situations like yours often pose greater risks to the system." Ayanna's patience wore thin. "Patterns? Situations like mine? Be specific, Mr. Whitmore." Whitmore's voice dropped, cold and defensive. I think we're veering into unnecessary territory. Let's not make this about something it isn't. Ayanna leaned forward, her voice sharp. No, let's call it what it is. You're using coded language to deny me coverage. You think I'm a risk because of who I am. His smug smile faltered. That's quite the accusation. I won't entertain baseless claims of discrimination. It's not baseless, Ayanna snapped. I meet your qualifications, yet you're inventing reasons to reject me. This is about your prejudice, not my eligibility. Whitmore's expression twisted into something sinister. You're out of line, Ms. Brooks. This isn't about race or bias. It's about business and sustainability. Business? Ayanna shot back. Denying coverage to someone who fits your policy for reasons you can't explain isn't business. It's bigotry. Whitmore smirked. Believe what you will, but our decision stands. Ayanna's chest burned with frustration, but she refused to let Whitmore see her falter. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Thomas Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair, his expression fixed in a mixture of condescension and feigned politeness. It's not personal, Ms. Brooks, he said, his voice dripping with insincerity. We're just trying to avoid a bad investment. Ayanna Brooks sat across from him, her fists tightening around the edges of her folder. She spoke slowly, her voice trembling with restrained anger. A bad investment? You're talking about me like I'm a statistic on a ledger, not a human being. I'm a person with a life, a medical condition that requires treatment, and a right to be treated with dignity. Whitmore shrugged, the faintest smirk tugging at his lips. That's the harsh reality of the insurance industry. It's nothing personal. Ayanna's voice rose, her tone laced with a fiery determination. It is personal when your so-called reality is rooted in prejudice. You think you can hide behind corporate policies, but what you're doing is wrong, and deep down, you know it. Whitmore's smirk widened as he leaned back, his arms folding across his chest. Believe whatever helps you sleep at night, Ms. Brooks, but the decision is final. This policy isn't for you. Ayanna's resolve hardened. I'm not leaving until you give me a real answer, she said firmly, her voice unwavering. Whitmore's tone grew clipped. You already have your answer. If you can't accept it, security will be more than happy to explain further. Ayanna didn't flinch. No, you explain it. Right here, right now. Why am I being denied when I've met every requirement? Whitmore's calm facade cracked, his irritation seeping through. He leaned forward, his voice cold and sharp. You're being denied because I say so. That's all the explanation you're getting. Ayanna locked eyes with him, her voice slicing through the tension. And that's why I'm not leaving. The room seemed to shrink as the air grew heavy with tension. Whitmore's polished demeanor had evaporated, replaced by simmering hostility. He leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. Let me explain something to you, Ms. Brooks. I don't owe you an explanation. This isn't a negotiation. You don't meet our standards. End of story. Ayanna's fists clenched tighter, but her voice remained steady. I meet every standard outlined in your policy. The only thing that doesn't meet your standards is me, and we both know why. Whitmore's mocking tone deepened. Do we? Maybe the real problem here is that you can't accept reality. Not everyone gets what they want in life. Ayanna leaned closer, her voice calm but brimming with righteous anger. You're right. Not everyone gets what they deserve, especially when people like you are making the decisions. But I'm not going to sit here and let you dismiss me without justification. Whitmore's smirk twisted into something cruel. Justification. You want me to spell it out for you? Fine. You're not the kind of applicant we're looking for. Your profile screams liability, financially, medically, and frankly, professionally. I've seen this story before, and I'm not interested in a repeat performance. Liability? Ayanna's voice rose, her composure cracking slightly. What you really mean is because I'm black, don't you? You're hiding behind vague excuses because you think you can get away with it. But this is blatant discrimination. Whitmore laughed sharply, his tone venomous. You think every denial is about race? How convenient. Maybe, Ms. Brooks, you should take a good look at your own situation instead of blaming others for your shortcomings. Ayanna's breath quickened, but but she stood her ground. My only shortcoming is expecting you to treat me like any other applicant. But you've already decided people like me aren't worth your time or your resources. Whitmore slapped his hand on the desk, the sound echoing through the room. Watch yourself, Ms. Brooks. Accusing me of racism won't change the fact that this policy isn't for you. And frankly, your attitude is proving my point. Ayanna rose to her feet, her voice steady and cutting. My attitude? You've insulted me, denied me what I'm entitled to, and now you're blaming me for standing up to your bias? Do you even hear yourself? Whitmore's face reddened, his temper slipping. I don't have to listen to this. You're wasting my time and yours. Ayanna leaned over the desk, her voice unwavering. You made this personal. You could have processed my application like anyone else's, but instead, you made it about me, who I am, what I look like. You're the problem here, not me. Whitmore stood abruptly, his towering frame meant to intimidate. I think we're done here. We're not, Ayanna replied. I'm not leaving until you give me a real reason. Say it plainly, Mr. Whitmore. Why am I being denied? Whitmore's glare was icy, his voice a blade. Fine. Applicants like you, black women, are always looking for a handout. You come in here with your sob stories and expect us to bend over backward. Well, not today. I've seen your type before, and I'm not falling for it. Ayanna's heart raced, but her gaze remained steady. Her voice was calm, but her words cut deep. That's exactly what I needed to hear. And that's why this isn't over. Not here, not now, and not in court. Whitmore's smirk returned, his confidence brimming. Court? Do you even know who you're dealing with? This company's lawyers will destroy you before you even file a case. Ayanna's eyes burned with resolve. We'll see about that. People like you always think they're untouchable, until they're not. Thomas Whitmore snapped toward the sound of the knock at the door, his irritation palpable as he turned back to Ayanna Brooks. And neither are you, apparently, he growled, his voice laced with venom. So let's see how much more of my time you plan to waste. Ayanna crossed her arms, her stance firm and defiant. Until you do your job properly, she said, her voice unwavering. I'm not going anywhere. Whitmore's jaw tightened, his frustration now written across every line of his face. He slammed his palm onto the desk, the force causing the neatly stacked papers to shift slightly. You've made your point, Ms. Brooks, he barked, his tone sharp and cutting. Now, let me make mine. You're wasting my time, and I'm done entertaining this charade. Get up, walk out that door, and save yourself the embarrassment. Ayanna leaned forward, her voice calm but edged with fire. Embarrassment. The only embarrassment here is you, Mr. Whitmore, sitting there, clinging to your authority as if it justifies the reprehensible way you treat people. Do you even hear yourself? Whitmore's face darkened, his mask of corporate professionalism cracking. I don't need a lecture from someone who doesn't even understand how the real world works. He shot back, his voice sharp and dismissive. You want sympathy? Go look for it somewhere else. This is a business, and in this business, we don't reward sob stories. Ayanna felt her blood boil, but she forced herself to remain composed. You keep saying this isn't personal, she said, her voice steady, but everything about your words, your tone, your actions, screams otherwise. You don't think I belong here. You don't think I'm worth your time. Well, you're wrong. Whitmore sneered, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Let me tell you something, Ms. Brooks. People like you are the reason policies like ours have to exist in the first place. You want to play the victim, but the truth is, you've already lost. Ayanna rose to her feet, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. No, the truth is, you've already lost. You've exposed yourself for what you really are, a racist, a coward, and an insult to the position you hold. If you think I'm going to sit here and take your abuse, think again. Whitmore straightened, his towering frame meant to intimidate. I don't have to listen to this, he spat, his voice cold and dismissive. His hand shot toward a button on his desk, and within moments, the door opened, and 2 security guards entered. Their presence added an ominous weight to the room. Escort Ms. Brooks out of the building, Whitmore ordered, his tone dripping with disdain. She's no longer welcome here. Ayana's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. Turning to the guards, she said, "You're really going to drag me out for standing up for myself? Go ahead. Add more fuel to the lawsuit I'm about to file." The guards hesitated, their eyes flicking between Ayana and Whitmore. Seeing their hesitation, Whitmore's expression darkened. "Do your job," he snapped. One of the guards stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. "Ma'am, we need you to leave." Ayana didn't move. "This man is discriminating against me. You can carry me out if you want, but I'm not going quietly." The guards exchanged uneasy glances before one of them gently placed a hand on her arm. "Please, ma'am," he said, his tone cautious. Ayana turned her glare on Whitmore. "I hope you enjoy the spotlight, Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "Because when this goes public, you're going to wish you'd kept your mouth shut." Whitmore chuckled darkly, his smirk returning. "Go ahead. Scream all you want. No one's going to care about your little crusade." As the guards began escorting her toward the door, Ayana pulled her arm free, her voice unwavering. "We'll see who no one cares about when you're the one packing up your desk." Whitmore didn't respond, his face returning to a mask of indifference as the door closed behind her. For a moment, the room was silent, the tension lingering like a ghost. Whitmore exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Some people just don't know when to quit," he muttered to himself. Outside, Ayana stormed down the street, her fists clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She could still hear Whitmore's sneering voice in her head, still see the smirk on his face as he dismissed her like she was nothing. The humiliation of being dragged out of the office burned in her chest, but it was quickly replaced by a searing resolve. She turned into an alley, away from the indifferent hum of the city, and leaned against the cold brick wall. Her breaths came in short, furious bursts as tears of frustration welled in her eyes. She hated that she felt this way, angry, helpless, small. She clenched her fists tighter, the pain grounding her as she muttered aloud, her voice trembling with rage. "This is what they think of us," she spat. "Always a problem. Always less than. No matter how hard we work, how much we prove, it's never enough." The tears spilled over, but they didn't extinguish the fire inside her. If anything, they stoked it, fueling her determination. She paced the narrow alley, her thoughts tumbling out in fragmented, bitter bursts. "All my life," she muttered. "Every damn time. I've done everything right. I've met their requirements, jumped through their hoops, played their stupid games, and it's still not enough." She slammed her fist into the wall, the sharp pain a counterpoint to the ache in her chest. Her voice rose, echoing in the confined space. "Why does it always have to be like this? Why do we have to fight tooth and nail for things they hand out to everyone else without a second thought?" She thought of the years she'd spent building her career, scraping by to make ends meet while chasing her dreams. She thought of every time she'd been overlooked, dismissed, or quietly undermined by people like Whitmore, people who looked at her and saw nothing but their own prejudices. "They don't even try to hide it anymore," she muttered bitterly. "People like you, your type. They say it like we don't know exactly what they mean." Ayana Brooks leaned against the rough brick wall, her tears slowing as her anger transformed into a fierce determination. She tilted her head back, the cool evening air brushing against her skin as her breath formed soft clouds in the dim light. Her voice was low but firm as she whispered to herself, "This isn't just about him. It's the entire system. They built it to keep us out, to hold us down, and they expect us to just accept it." She exhaled deeply, wiping her damp cheeks with the back of her hand. The fire within her hadn't dimmed, it had sharpened, becoming a focused energy. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her thumb hesitating over the blank screen. After a moment's pause, she opened the camera app and pressed record. Her voice was steady, though the rawness of her emotions was evident. "My name is Ayana Brooks," she began, staring directly into the lens. "Today, I walked into Pinnacle Insurance to apply for health coverage. I met every single requirement, but I was denied. Not because I didn't qualify, but because I'm black." She stopped, the weight of her words hanging in the air before she continued, her voice gaining strength. Thomas Whitmore, the manager, didn't even try to hide it. He called me a liability, said people like me abuse the system. He didn't bother to mask his prejudice with corporate jargon. And I'm not letting him get away with it. Ayana's voice hardened, the fire in her eyes blazing as she continued. This isn't just about me. It's about every person who's been dismissed, disrespected, or outright denied because of the color of their skin. I'm going to fight this, not just for myself, but for everyone who's been through this. Enough is enough. She ended the recording and stared at the screen for a long moment. Her reflection stared back, tired and angry, but unbroken. With a deep breath, she saved the video and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Pushing off the wall, Ayana stepped back into the bustling street. The city moved around her, indifferent to the storm raging in her mind. But she wasn't going to stay silent. Not this time. The next morning, Ayana sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open and phone buzzing with notifications. The video she had posted the night before had gone viral, taking on a life of its own. She'd shared it on her social media with the caption, "This is discrimination in plain sight. This is what we face every day." The post had already been shared thousands of times, and the comments poured in, a mix of support and vitriol. "Stay strong, sis. We see you. Playing the race card again, I see. Typical nonsense. Don't let them silence you. Fight back!" Ayana scrolled through the comments, her emotions shifting between gratitude and frustration. Finally, she closed the app, rubbing her temples as she tried to gather her thoughts. Her best friend, Camille Jenkins, walked into the room carrying 2 cups of coffee. "All right," Camille said with a determined smile, setting the cups down on the table. "I've got caffeine and a plan." Ayana managed a weak smile, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly at Camille's presence. "Honestly," she admitted, "I'm exhausted. That video blew up overnight, and now it feels like everyone's watching me. I don't know if I'm ready for all of this." "You've been ready your whole life," Camille said, sitting across from her. "That video was powerful. It's exactly what people needed to see. But we can't stop there. You need to take action." Ayana nodded slowly. "I know I can't let him get away with it, but I'm not sure what the next step is. Filing a complaint? Getting a lawyer? It all feels overwhelming." Camille leaned forward, her expression serious. "I've been doing some research. There's a civil rights lawyer named James Porter. He's taken down corporations way bigger than Pinnacle Insurance. I think he's your guy." "A lawyer?" Ayana hesitated, the idea feeling massive. "That feels big." "Because it is," Camille replied firmly. "This isn't just about you, Ayana. It's about every single person who's been treated the way you were. You've got the chance to make a real difference here." Ayana stared at her coffee, the steam curling lazily upward. The thought of taking on Pinnacle Insurance, a behemoth of a corporation, was daunting. But then she thought of Whitmore's smug face, his dismissive tone, and the venom in his words. "You're right," she said finally, looking up at Camille. "I can't let this slide. I'll call him." Later that day, Ayana sat in James Porter's office. The small space was cluttered with bookshelves, overflowing with legal texts and case files. Porter, a tall man with a commanding presence, listened intently as Ayana recounted her experience. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his tone measured, "what you're describing isn't just a case of discrimination. It's systemic." Thomas Whitmore wasn't just speaking for himself. He was reflecting a corporate culture that tolerates, maybe even encourages, this kind of behavior. Ayana nodded, her resolve solidifying. "So, what can we do about it?" Porter's faint smile carried a spark of determination. "First, we file a formal complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to get the ball rolling. Then, we start gathering evidence, your testimony, your application documents, and any patterns of discrimination at Pinnacle Insurance. It's going to be a fight, but it's one we can win." Ayana leaned forward, her voice firm. "I'm ready to do whatever it takes. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did." "Good," Porter said decisively, "because cases like this don't just change policies, they change lives. And Pinnacle Insurance needs to learn that actions like these have consequences." Chapter. That evening, as Ayana walked home, She felt an unusual mix of anxiety and resolve. The battle ahead was daunting, but for the first time since her confrontation with Whitmore, she felt hope. The system that had sought to silence her was about to face its reckoning. Ayanna Brooks felt the embers of anger from her encounter with Thomas Whitmore still smoldering within her. Yet now, that anger had a purpose, transforming into the fuel for a battle that went far beyond herself. This wasn't just about her denial. It was about exposing a system designed to exclude and silence countless others. As she stepped into her modest apartment, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was from her viral post. "Stay strong. We're behind you," the message read. A faint smile tugged at Ayanna's lips, and she tightened her grip on the phone. For the first time in a long while, she felt a glimmer of hope. People were listening. She wasn't fighting this alone anymore. A week later, Ayanna sat across from Darren Morgan, a sharp, seasoned civil rights attorney. His office was small but filled with an air of determination. The desk between them was cluttered with documents, her application to Pinnacle Insurance, email exchanges, and a detailed transcript of her encounter with Whitmore. Darren tapped his pen rhythmically against a notepad as he studied the materials. "You've done an excellent job keeping everything organized," Darren remarked, glancing up at her. "This is a solid foundation, but now we need to dig deeper." Ayanna leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. "What exactly does that mean?" she asked, her voice steady but eager. "It means we're looking for patterns," Darren explained. "Thomas Whitmore didn't deny your application on a whim. His actions and words are symptomatic of a larger issue: systemic discrimination within Pinnacle Insurance. See? So, you're saying there are other cases like mine?" Ayanna pressed. "Exactly," Darren said with a nod. "We're going to file a motion to subpoena their records. If we can uncover similar instances where minority applicants were unfairly denied, it will strengthen our case. But that's not all. We'll also need testimonies from former employees, potential whistleblowers, anyone who can corroborate what we already suspect." Ayanna exhaled slowly, absorbing the enormity of what he was describing. "And how long is this going to take?" Darren's expression softened slightly. "Longer than either of us would like. Corporations like Pinnacle Insurance don't roll over easily. They'll fight tooth and nail to protect their image. But don't let that discourage you. Every step we take is a step closer to the truth." That evening, Ayanna sat at her dining table with her laptop open to a blank email draft. Darren had suggested reaching out to anyone she knew who might have dealt with Pinnacle Insurance, hoping to uncover others with similar experiences. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she hesitated. Memories of people she'd met through her freelance work flickered through her mind. Perhaps some of them had faced the same silent injustices she had. Finally, she began typing. "Hi. I hope this email finds you well. I'm writing to ask if you've had any experiences with Pinnacle Insurance. Specifically, if you've been denied coverage unfairly. I'm currently working with a lawyer on a case against them, and would greatly appreciate any information or stories you're willing to share. Thank you for your time, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to discuss this further. Best regards, Ayanna Brooks." She hit send and leaned back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. This wasn't just her battle anymore. It was about uncovering a pattern of injustice that had likely harmed countless others. 2 days later, Darren called Ayanna into his office. She arrived to find him seated behind his desk, a triumphant gleam in his eye. He held up a folder. "We've got our first lead," he announced. "A former Pinnacle employee reached out. They worked under Thomas Whitmore and have some very interesting things to say." Ayanna's pulse quickened as she took a seat. "What kind of things?" "Discrimination, favoritism, and deliberate targeting of minority applicants for denials," Darren replied, flipping through his notes. "It's worse than we thought. Whitmore didn't just deny applications, he bragged about it to his colleagues." Ayanna's grip on the edge of her chair tightened. "He bragged?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief and anger. Darren nodded grimly. "Apparently, he's used phrases like cleaning up the applicant pool and weeding out liabilities for years. While it's all been informal, off-the-record comments, our contact is willing to testify." Ayanna's jaw clenched as her anger bubbled over. "This isn't just about me. This is who he is, what he does. Exactly, Darren said, his tone resolute. Whitmore isn't just a rogue manager. He's a symptom of a larger problem at Pinnacle Insurance. If we can prove that his behavior was known and tolerated by upper management, we'll have a case that could shake the entire company. Ayanna straightened, her determination hardening. What's our next move? We prepare, Darren replied. I'll file the subpoena for their records and start prepping our witness. But be ready. Pinnacle's legal team will come after you hard. They'll try to discredit you, paint you as emotional or vindictive. You'll need to stay calm and focused. Ayanna met his gaze, her voice firm. I've come too far to back down now. That evening, Ayanna sat on her couch, her laptop resting on her knees as she scrolled through her email inbox. A handful of responses to her outreach email had trickled in. Most were supportive, but hesitant to share personal details. Then one subject line caught her eye. Pinnacle Insurance Denial Story. Happy to help. Her heart raced as she opened the email. It was from a woman named Angela, who described an eerily similar experience, being denied coverage despite meeting every qualification. Angela detailed the frustration and humiliation she'd felt and expressed her willingness to share her story to help Ayanna's case. Relief washed over Ayanna as she leaned back, closing her eyes briefly. She wasn't alone in this fight. By the end of the week, Darren had compiled a growing list of witnesses and evidence. Each new detail painted a damning picture of a discriminatory system, adding fuel to their case. Ayanna felt the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on her shoulders, but it was accompanied by a burgeoning sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or devalued by people like Thomas Whitmore. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Ayanna Brooks sat at her kitchen table, staring blankly at her social media feed. The initial wave of support for her viral video had been uplifting, a spark of hope amidst the chaos. But now, the tide was shifting. Among the messages of encouragement, hateful and dismissive comments began to surface. She's just looking for a payout. These cases never go anywhere. Just drop it, lady. Maybe, if she wasn't so aggressive, they wouldn't have denied her. Her chest tightened as she read the words, each one cutting deeper than the last. With a frustrated motion, she slammed her laptop shut, the sharp sound echoing in the silence of her apartment. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she snatched it up, hoping for a reprieve from the negativity. Hey, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady when she saw Darren's name on the screen. Ayanna, I wanted to give you a heads up, Darren began, his tone cautious. Her stomach twisted. What's going on? Horizon's legal team is starting to push back. Hard, Darren explained. They've issued a public statement denying any wrongdoing. They claim your application was rejected for valid reasons and that your accusations are baseless. Worse, they've started digging into your background. Digging into my background? Ayanna asked, gripping her phone tightly. What does that even mean? They're looking for anything they can use to discredit you, Darren said. Old financial records, social media posts, anything they can spin to paint you in a negative light. They're trying to make me look like the problem instead of addressing what they did, Ayanna said, her voice rising with indignation. Exactly, Darren confirmed. It's a classic tactic. Shift the focus, undermine the victim, and muddy the waters, but don't let it get to you. We anticipated this, and it's a sign your case has merit. Stay calm and focused. They're doing this because they know they're in trouble. Ayanna nodded, though Darren couldn't see her. I'm not backing down, she said firmly. Let them dig. They won't find anything. That's the spirit, Darren said, a note of encouragement in his voice. I'll keep you updated. In the meantime, try to tune out the noise. It's all part of their strategy to rattle you. The next morning, Ayanna woke to an email from her friend Monica. The subject line read, Have you seen this? Her heart sank as she opened the link. It led to an article from a gossip-style news site, littered with half-truths and baseless insinuations. The headline was bold and accusatory. Insurance denial case. Is Ayanna Brooks really a victim? The article dredged up irrelevant details about her finances, questioning her ability to pay premiums despite the evidence she had provided. It painted her as attention-seeking and manipulative, accusing her of playing the race card to mask her own failings. Ayanna slammed her laptop shut, burying her face in her hands. Her anger flared, but beneath it was a creeping vulnerability. How could they twist the truth so blatantly? Her phone rang, and she answered without checking the caller ID. "Ayanna, it's Monica," her friend said urgently. "I just saw the article. Don't let it get to you. It's garbage, and anyone with half a brain can see that." "Can they?" Ayanna asked, her voice trembling. "Because it feels like they're winning. They're twisting everything, making it look like I'm the problem." "They're desperate," Monica said firmly. "That's all this is. They're throwing everything they can at you because they know they can't defend what they did. Don't let them shake you." Ayanna took a deep breath, steadying herself. "You're right. I just didn't think it would get this ugly." Monica's voice softened. "I know, but you've got this. You've got Darren, you've got evidence, and you've got so many people standing behind you. Don't forget that." Later that day, Ayanna sat across from Darren in his office. He slid a copy of the gossip article across the desk, his expression calm but determined. "We knew they'd play dirty," he said, "but this is just the beginning. They're trying to intimidate you, hoping you'll back down." "Well, it's not going to work," Ayanna replied, her voice steely. "Let them throw whatever they want at me. I'm not quitting." Darren nodded approvingly. "Good, because we've just received court approval for our subpoena. Horizon's internal records are officially on the table." Ayanna's eyes widened. "You mean we'll get to see everything? The denials? The patterns?" "That's the idea," Darren confirmed. "If there's a paper trail, and I'd bet there is, we'll find it. And when we do, it'll blow their defense out of the water." Ayanna felt a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. "So, what's next?" "Next, we prepare for their counterattack," Darren said. "They'll try to block the subpoena, delay the process, anything to keep us from getting those records, but we'll be ready." Ayanna leaned back in her chair, her resolve hardening. "Let them try. I've already lost too much to stop now." As she walked home that evening, Ayanna checked her phone. A steady stream of supportive messages trickled in, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this fight. "Don't give up. You're fighting for all of us. Proud of you for standing up. Keep going." Each message strengthened her resolve. This wasn't just her battle. It was bigger than her, bigger than Thomas Whitmore, even bigger than Pinnacle Insurance. She wouldn't let them win. Meanwhile, in his corner office at Pinnacle Insurance, Thomas Whitmore sat behind his desk, his scowl deepening as he read through the latest updates. The subpoena had hit harder than he anticipated, and now upper management was demanding answers. "They're all overreacting," he muttered, tossing an email onto the desk. "One loudmouth gets denied, and suddenly it's a scandal." Typical. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a sneer. "She thinks she's so special," he muttered. "Just another entitled liability looking for a handout. They always play the same game. Cry discrimination when things don't go their way." Drumming his fingers on the desk, he allowed himself a moment of cruel satisfaction. She's not the first to pull this stunt, and she won't be the last, but they never win. Pinnacle is untouchable, and so am I. Thomas Whitmore reclined in his office chair, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He reviewed the legal strategy meticulously laid out before him, each line designed to discredit and dismantle Ayanna Brooks's case. A flicker of her determined face crossed his mind, and he scoffed aloud. "Let her run her little crusade," he muttered. "She'll burn out when she realizes nobody cares about her sob story. And when we're finished with her, she'll regret ever stepping foot in my office." Later that afternoon, Ayanna and Darren sat across from Angela Davis, a former employee of Pinnacle Insurance, in Darren's office. Angela, a woman in her early 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor, recounted her years working under Whitmore. Her voice was steady, but the weight of her experiences was evident in every word. "He was relentless," Angela began. "Whitmore made it clear that minority applicants were liabilities. If their applications crossed his desk, he'd stamp denied without even reviewing them." Ayanna clenched her fists under the table, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "And no one said anything? No one stopped him?" Angela shook her head, her expression weary but resolute. If anyone dared to push back, they were out the door before they could pack their things. Upper management turned a blind eye. They gave him free rein to run things however he wanted. It was an open secret. Darren leaned forward, his pen poised over his notepad. "Angela, would you be willing to testify to this in court?" Angela hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Yes, people need to know what kind of man he is, and what kind of company Pinnacle really is." Ayanna reached across the table, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "Thank you. I know this isn't easy, but your courage means everything to me and to so many others." Angela smiled faintly, a hint of hope softening her features. "You're brave to stand up to them. Don't let them intimidate you." That evening, Ayanna walked home with Angela's words echoing in her mind. The weight of the evidence they had gathered and the growing support behind their case fueled her resolve. The battle against Pinnacle Insurance wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been dismissed or dehumanized by a system that valued profits over people. A week later, Ayanna stood in the courthouse hallway, clutching a notebook tightly in her hands. Darren paced beside her, his eyes focused on the notes on his tablet. The pre-trial hearing was moments away, and the tension in the air was almost tangible. "Are you ready?" Darren asked, pausing to look at her. Ayanna nodded, her voice steady. "I've come too far to back down now." Darren gave her an encouraging smile. "Good. Remember, they'll try to rattle you. Stay calm, answer honestly, and don't let them twist your words." She nodded again, exhaling slowly to steady her nerves as the courtroom doors swung open. Inside, Pinnacle's legal team was already seated, their pristine suits and towering stacks of documents creating an imposing sight. At the head of the table sat Whitmore, his expression cold and detached. Ayanna forced herself to look away, focusing instead on the judge seated at the front of the room. The hearing began with Pinnacle's lead attorney, Richard Haynes, arguing to dismiss the subpoena for internal records. Haynes, a seasoned litigator with a sharp tongue, stood with calculated poise. "Your Honor," he began, "this subpoena is nothing more than a fishing expedition. The plaintiff has provided no concrete evidence to suggest systemic wrongdoing on the part of Pinnacle Insurance. Allowing this request would set a dangerous precedent." Darren stood to respond, his tone calm but resolute. "Your Honor, the evidence we've already presented demonstrates a clear pattern of discriminatory practices within Pinnacle Insurance. This subpoena is not a fishing expedition. It's a necessary step to uncover the full extent of the defendant's misconduct." The judge, a stern woman with piercing eyes, studied the documents in front of her. After a brief pause, she turned to Haynes. "Mr. Haynes, the plaintiff has provided sufficient preliminary evidence to justify further investigation. The subpoena stands." A wave of relief washed over Ayanna, but it was short-lived. Whitmore leaned toward Haynes and whispered something, prompting the attorney to rise once more, a smirk playing on his lips. "Your Honor," Haynes said smoothly, "while we respect the court's decision, we would like to submit new evidence regarding the plaintiff's credibility." Ayanna's stomach dropped as Haynes gestured to a folder handed to him by one of his associates. "We have reason to believe that Ms. Brooks has a history of financial instability that raises questions about her ability to meet the obligations of any insurance policy. Additionally, her social media activity suggests a pattern of behavior inconsistent with her claims." Darren immediately stood, his voice firm. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a blatant attempt to smear my client's character. The plaintiff's financial history and social media activity are irrelevant to the case at hand." The judge raised her hand to silence them. "I'll allow the defense to present their evidence, but I remind both parties to keep this hearing focused on the issues of discrimination and denial of coverage." As Haynes laid out his so-called evidence, Ayanna's anger simmered beneath the surface. The financial records were cherry-picked to paint her as irresponsible, while light-hearted social media posts and out-of-context photos were twisted to suggest a lack of credibility. Darren, however, remained unflappable during his cross-examination. "Mr. Haynes," Darren began, holding up one of Ayanna's social media posts, "are you suggesting that a person's ability to pay premiums is determined by their personal sense of humor?" Haynes faltered, but quickly recovered. Of course not, but it speaks to character. Character? Darren interrupted, his tone cutting. Let's talk about character. Is it true that Pinnacle Insurance has denied coverage to a disproportionately high number of minority applicants? Haynes bristled, his confidence visibly shaken. We deny coverage based on legitimate, Darren pressed on, not allowing him to finish. Legitimate reasons, like stamping denied on applications without reviewing them, like instructing employees to weed out liabilities? Or does Pinnacle's definition of legitimate simply depend on the color of the applicant's skin? The courtroom fell silent, the weight of Darren's words hanging high in the air. Ayanna Brooks felt the weight of the courtroom buzz as Richard Haynes scrambled to respond to Darren Morgan's pointed question. Explain the term demographic concerns in your internal documents. Darren had pressed, his voice rising slightly. Or the policies flagged for denial based on zip codes predominantly populated by minorities. Is that legitimate criteria? Or is it discrimination in disguise? The room erupted in murmurs. Haynes hesitated, his polished demeanor cracking under the intensity of Darren's argument. The judge called for order, her sharp gavel cutting through the whispers. As the hearing concluded, Ayanna stepped outside, the crisp air brushing her face. Darren joined her, his expression a mix of determination and cautious optimism. They're on the defensive, he said, his tone firm. They wouldn't be pulling stunts like that if they weren't worried. Ayanna nodded, her thoughts racing. But it's not over yet. They're still trying to discredit me, and we're not going to let them, Darren replied. Securing that subpoena was a major win. Once we have those records, their entire defense will crumble. Ayanna turned her gaze to the city skyline, her resolve hardening with each passing moment. Good, she said, her voice steady, because they're not just going to pay for what they did to me. They're going to pay for all of it. The lies, the denials, the discrimination. Darren smiled faintly, a spark of admiration in his eyes. That's the spirit. We'll keep pushing, and when we get to trial, they won't know what hit them. The next morning, Ayanna sat in Darren's office, her hands trembling slightly as she held the thick packet of documents he had delivered. These were the internal records Pinnacle Insurance had been forced to turn over, a treasure trove of evidence exposing their discriminatory practices. As Darren methodically reviewed the documents, his usual calm demeanor carried an edge of satisfaction. This, Darren said, holding up a memo marked confidential, is the nail in their coffin. Ayanna leaned forward, her eyes scanning the page. The memo, written by a high-ranking executive, detailed the company's so-called risk assessment protocols. The language was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Minority applicants were to be flagged for additional scrutiny, and, in many cases, denied coverage outright. They didn't even bother to hide it, Ayanna said, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. This memo spells out exactly what they've been doing. Darren nodded grimly. And look at this, he said, flipping to another document. It was a report breaking down denial rates by demographics. The statistics were damning. Minority applicants were denied at 3 times the rate of white applicants, even when their qualifications were identical. Ayanna's chest tightened as she read the report. How did they get away with this for so long? They buried it, Darren replied. And they relied on people like Whitmore to enforce these policies without question. But now, it's all coming to light. The tension mounted as Pinnacle's legal team ramped up their efforts to discredit Ayanna. Another article surfaced online, accusing her of pushing a political agenda rather than seeking justice. Trolls flooded her social media with hateful comments, accusing her of lying, exaggerating, and playing the victim. One evening, Monica called, her voice tinged with concern. Ayanna, are you okay? The things they're saying about you. I'm fine, Ayanna interrupted, though her voice betrayed her exhaustion. Let them talk. I'm not going to let their lies distract me. Monica sighed. You're stronger than I am. Just know I'm here for you, okay? Thanks, Monica, Ayanna said softly. I'll be fine. I have to be. But when the call ended, Ayanna sat in the dim light of her apartment, the weight of the fight pressing down on her. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she whispered to herself, They think they can break me, but they have no idea who they're dealing with. A few days later, Ayanna and Darren sat in a packed courtroom for another pretrial hearing. Pinnacle's legal team had filed a motion to dismiss key pieces of evidence, arguing that the documents obtained through the subpoena were misinterpreted and irrelevant. Haynes stood confidently before the judge, his tone polished but insincere. "Your Honor, these documents have been taken out of context. They reflect standard business practices, not discriminatory intent." Darren rose to counter, his voice steady and commanding. "Your Honor, the documents clearly outline a pattern of discrimination against minority applicants. This isn't a matter of misinterpretation, it's a matter of systemic bias. Plain and simple." The judge, her expression unreadable, listened intently as Darren meticulously laid out his argument. He highlighted specific sections of the memos and reports, showing how they directly supported Ayanna's claims. When he finished, the judge turned her sharp gaze to Haynes. "Mr. Haynes, your argument to dismiss this evidence lacks merit. The motion is denied." A wave of relief swept over Ayanna, but it was short-lived. From across the room, she caught the venomous glare of Thomas Whitmore. His eyes were filled with pure hatred, a silent promise that he wasn't done fighting. As the trial date loomed closer, Pinnacle Insurance began to feel the pressure. Whistleblowers stepped forward, corroborating Ayanna's claims and painting an even darker picture of the company's practices. Major news outlets picked up the story, amplifying Ayanna's voice and shifting public opinion. One evening, Darren met Ayanna in his office, a rare smile on his face. "They've just offered a settlement," he said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. Ayanna glanced at the figure. It was substantial, enough to make her pause, but after a moment, she shook her head, her resolve unwavering. "I'm not taking it." Darren nodded, as though he'd expected her answer. "Good, because this case isn't about the money. It's about holding them accountable, and that's exactly what we're going to do," Ayanna said, her voice firm. That night, Ayanna sat in her apartment, reviewing her notes for the upcoming trial. She thought of everything she'd endured, the humiliation, the smear campaigns, the relentless fight to be heard. But she also thought of the people who had reached out to her, the former employees, denied applicants, and countless others who shared their stories. She thought of Angela, who had risked her career to testify. Ayanna clenched her fists, the fire inside her burning brighter than ever. This wasn't just her battle anymore. It was a fight for justice, for change, and for every voice that had been silenced. And she wasn't going to stop until the truth prevailed. Ayanna Brooks leaned back in her chair, closing her notebook with a steady hand. Her mind swirled with the gravity of the battle she was about to face. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been dismissed, overlooked, or devalued by a system built on prejudice. "This is for all of us," she whispered, her voice resolute. With a deep breath, she stood, her determination burning brighter than ever. The courtroom was packed, the buzz of whispered conversations thick with anticipation. Reporters lined the back wall, cameras clicking as the high-profile case began. Ayanna sat at the plaintiff's table, her heart pounding as the judge's gavel struck the air, silencing the murmurs. "This court is now in session," the judge declared. "The case of Ayanna Brooks versus Pinnacle Insurance and Thomas Whitmore will proceed." Darren Morgan, Ayanna's attorney, rose with calm authority, his voice steady and commanding as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about complicated business practices or subjective opinions. This is about discrimination, blatant, systematic discrimination. My client, Ayanna Brooks, was denied health coverage not because of her qualifications, but because of her race. Today, we will present evidence that proves Pinnacle Insurance, under the direction of Thomas Whitmore, has systematically targeted and denied minority applicants. This case is about accountability. Justice demands it. As Darren spoke, Ayanna studied the jury's faces, searching for signs of engagement. Their eyes followed Darren intently, their expressions thoughtful, some even tinged with indignation. Across the aisle, Thomas Whitmore sat stiffly at the defense table, his rigid posture betraying the tension beneath his polished facade. His jaw twitched, and his fingers drummed rhythmically on the table. a subtle crack in his composure. Richard Haynes, Pinnacle's lead attorney, rose next, his tone smooth and polished as he addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the plaintiff will attempt to convince you that this case is about discrimination, but the evidence will show otherwise. Pinnacle Insurance evaluates applications based on objective criteria: income, medical history, and risk factors. Ms. Brooks's application simply did not meet these criteria. There was no bias, no prejudice, only due diligence. Ayanna's stomach twisted. She knew their strategy: twist the narrative, paint her as unreasonable, and minimize the damning evidence. The trial began with Darren calling Angela Davis, a former Pinnacle Insurance employee, to the stand. Angela, a poised yet weary woman, spoke firmly as she recounted her experiences under Whitmore's management. He made it clear that minority applicants were flagged as high risk regardless of their qualifications, she testified. He used terms like weeding out liabilities and cleaning up the applicant pool. It was an open secret among the staff. During cross-examination, Haynes attempted to discredit Angela, suggesting she was simply a disgruntled ex-employee with a vendetta. But Darren's redirect was sharp and precise, reinforcing Angela's credibility and tying her testimony to the internal documents obtained through the subpoena. Next, Darren presented the damning memos and spreadsheets. The jury leaned forward as Darren detailed the documents' contents. Minority applicants systematically flagged under vague terms like demographic concerns and zip code risk factors. Ayanna watched the jurors' faces shift, shock, disgust, and disbelief flickering across their expressions. These documents, Darren said, his voice rising with conviction, are not evidence of due diligence. They are evidence of systemic racism cloaked in bureaucratic language. This is not how a fair and equitable business operates. Ayanna took the stand next. As she raised her hand to take the oath, her heart pounded, but her voice was steady. She recounted her meeting with Whitmore, describing the dismissiveness and disdain she had faced. "He called me a liability," she said, her voice unwavering. "He wasn't judging my application. He was judging me." Haynes's cross-examination was invasive, aiming to rattle her. He brought up her financial history, trying to paint her as unstable. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his tone dripping with skepticism, "would you say your financial situation was entirely stable at the time of your application?" Ayanna held his gaze. "My financial records show that I met the income requirements," she replied firmly. "My stability wasn't in question. Only Thomas Whitmore's bias was." Switching tactics, Haynes brought up her social media posts, attempting to paint her as unprofessional. "Would you say these posts reflect the character of someone seeking a serious insurance policy?" he asked. Ayanna didn't flinch. "My social media has nothing to do with my qualifications for health insurance," she said. "This case is about discrimination, not my personal life." After days of testimony, Darren stood for his closing argument. His voice was calm but brimming with intensity. "This case is about power," he said. "The power to decide who gets access to basic human rights like health care and who doesn't. Pinnacle Insurance and Thomas Whitmore abused that power to discriminate against Ayanna Brooks. But today, you have the power to hold them accountable. You have the power to send a message that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." Haynes countered with polished deflections, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and the denial of Ayanna's application was based on objective factors. But as the jury filed out to deliberate, Ayanna felt a flicker of hope. Darren had laid out the truth, and now it was up to the jury to see it. The courtroom was silent as the jury returned. Ayanna's hands gripped the table's edge as the foreperson stood, unfolding the verdict. "In the case of Ayanna Brooks versus Pinnacle Insurance and Thomas Whitmore, we find in favor of the plaintiff," the foreperson declared. "We award the plaintiff $3 million in damages, consisting of $2 million in punitive damages." A collective gasp filled the room. Ayanna's breath hitched as tears welled in her eyes. Darren placed a hand on her shoulder, a quiet gesture of solidarity. Across the aisle, Whitmore's face twisted in fury, his carefully constructed facade shattered. As Ayanna walked out of the courtroom, the sunlight streaming through the doors felt warmer than it had in months. She had won, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or devalued. Justice had been served, and the fight for change had only just begun. The words rang out in the courtroom like a thunderclap. $3 million. The jury's verdict reverberated through the packed space, eliciting gasps and murmurs from the crowd. Naomi Carter sat still for a moment, the enormity of the decision sinking in. Tears welled in her eyes, a torrent of emotions washing over her. Relief, validation, and a sense of triumph. Darren Morgan, her steadfast attorney, placed a firm hand on her shoulder, his smile small but filled with pride. "We did it," Naomi whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. Darren shook his head, his tone resolute. "No, Naomi, you did it." Across the room, Ethan Reynolds sat frozen, his face drained of color, his lips pressed into a thin, bitter line as the reality of the verdict struck him. $3 million. The number echoed in his mind like a curse, and for the first time, his carefully crafted composure cracked. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Ethan waved him off, his gaze fixed on Naomi. "She thinks this makes her a hero," Ethan thought bitterly. "She got her payout, but this won't last. People like her always come crashing down eventually." Yet, as his eyes darted to the jury leaving the courtroom and reporters scribbling furiously, a sinking feeling set in. This wasn't just about the money. This was about his reputation, his career, his legacy, and he knew, deep down, that it was over. Later that afternoon, as the courthouse emptied, Naomi stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by a sea of supporters and flashing cameras. Reporters clamored for statements, their voices overlapping in a chaotic blur. Naomi raised a hand, signaling for quiet, and the crowd hushed. "This verdict isn't just for me," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "It's for everyone who has been dismissed, disrespected, and discriminated against. Today is proof that no one is untouchable, no matter how much power they think they have. Change is possible. And today is only the beginning." The crowd erupted into applause, but nearby, Ethan Reynolds shoved his way through the throng, his jaw clenched tightly. Reporters bombarded him with questions. "Mr. Reynolds, how do you respond to the verdict? What's next for you at Pinnacle Insurance?" Ethan ignored them, his face a mask of simmering fury as he headed for his waiting car. Inside, he slammed the door shut, his fists pounding the steering wheel in frustration. By evening, the fallout had begun. The $3 million verdict dominated the headlines. Landmark discrimination case rocks Pinnacle Insurance. Racist practices exposed. Naomi Carter's stunning victory. Pinnacle Insurance faces public backlash after courtroom defeat. Public outrage was swift and unforgiving. Customers threatened boycotts. Advocacy groups demanded accountability, and social media exploded with calls for justice. Within hours, Pinnacle's board of directors convened an emergency meeting. "Ethan Reynolds is a liability," one board member said sharply. "We can't afford to keep him on payroll." The decision was unanimous. That same afternoon, Ethan was terminated and escorted out of the building by security, carrying a single box of belongings. As he walked to his car, head down to avoid the jeering crowd, his mind churned with bitterness and denial. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "One verdict, and they throw me under the bus? After everything I've done for this company?" He stopped at his car, gripping the box so tightly his knuckles turned white. "They'll regret this. She'll regret this. None of this is over." But as he climbed into his car, the sting of humiliation pressed against his chest. For the first time, a crack in his self-assured facade appeared, though he quickly buried it beneath layers of resentment. His career was in ruins, his name now synonymous with discrimination and failure. And for the first time, he began to feel the weight of his actions, even if only briefly. Naomi learned of Ethan's firing later that day through an article online. The headline read, "Pinnacle Insurance fires Thomas Whitmore amid discrimination fallout." A small smile tugged at her lips as she read the details. This wasn't just about money, It was about accountability. For so long, people like Ethan had wielded their power unchecked, leaving destruction in their wake. Now, for once, he was facing the consequences of his actions. Minutes later, Monica called, her voice practically shouting through the phone. "Naomi, did you see? They fired him. That racist jerk is out." Naomi laughed, her tone lighter than it had been in months. "I saw. It's a start." "A start?" Monica exclaimed. "Girl, you've taken down an entire system. You should be celebrating." "I am," Naomi replied, glancing at her laptop, where messages of support continued to flood her inbox. "But there's still so much work to do." In the days that followed, the impact of the trial rippled across the nation. Naomi received messages from people everywhere, individuals sharing their own stories of discrimination and thanking her for her courage. She responded to as many as she could, offering words of encouragement and solidarity. One evening, as she sat at her desk, she drafted a post for her social media. "This verdict isn't the end. It's a beginning. To everyone who's been silenced, dismissed, or ignored, your voice matters. Your fight matters. Together, we can change the system, one step at a time." As she hit post, Naomi leaned back in her chair, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over her. The fight wasn't over. There was still so much work to be done. But for the first time in years, she felt the weight of victory. She had taken on a system designed to silence her, and she had won. And she wasn't stopping there. The future was hers to shape.